On April 28, 2025, the electrical grid of Spain and Portugal went down. It was blackout, starting at 12:33, and power was only fully restored 13 hours later. The consequences were numerous. Trains came to a halt, including those mid-journey in the middle of the countryside. No subway, traffic jams everywhere as traffic lights stopped working. Long lines were seen forming outside banks, and merchants were only accepting cash without being able to give change since cash registers wouldn't open. Internet and smartphones were also chaos, with only critical facilities like hospitals still being powered by backup generators. In short, it was potentially a big mess, which luckily ended well as the current assessment shows limited impact for such a large-scale event. Meanwhile, this is the kind of accident that can be extremely serious. Even though Spain and Portugal recovered in 13 hours, a blackout can severely damage the grid, and power might not come back for several days, depending on the type of failure. Beyond a few days, heavy electricity-intensive industries like steel plant or aluminium factories, which are very expensive facilities worth hundreds of millions of dollars, are also at risk of permanent damage. If the metal tanks are not kept heated, the liquid metal solidifies and the whole plant may have to be scrapped. Fortunately, it happened at noon during spring in Spain, so the weather and climate helped a lot. If you look at the example of Uri storm in Texas, which caused a blackout of several days, during a polar storm, the toll was 250 people dead, with 200 billion in damage to infrastructure. So this kind of event can be truly catastrophic, depending on a multitude of variable factors. So let's go into it. What exactly happened on April 28th? And more importantly, can we really say that this incident was caused by the growing share of renewable energy on the grid, as many commentators in the media have claimed? To put it simply, on April 28 in Spain, there were indeed losses in power generation, apparently coming from solar power plants. That's why it's tempting for critics to point the finger at intermittent renewables. But in reality, we still don't know what caused such generation losses. It's all a bit of a mystery at this stage. Nobody really knows, because at the moment of the outage occurred, the interconnection was actually under very little stress. Just a few hundred megawatts, with no major fluctuations. That's the green line on the graph. Also, on this other chart showing the grid's forecast from the day before, with the green and yellow lines, we can see that the Spanish grid wasn't expecting anything unusual either before 1 p.m. It's only at 1 p.m. that they were forecasting significant exports volume of around 2,300 megawatts. That's the yellow line dropping after 1 p.m. So basically, they weren't expecting anything unusual, and well, nothing unusual actually happened. So, are intermittent renewable energies, namely solar and wind, good or bad? Well, as usual, there's no such thing as bad tool, only bad system design. Managing an electrical grid doesn't lend itself well to quick shortcuts. The equation is, above all, an economic one. And today, whether that's unfortunate or fortunate, the reality is that no technology, nuclear, fossil, or renewable, can claim to be vastly superior and without flaws. Personally, as a chairman of an industrial company whose mission is to find solutions to address this kind of challenge, we're going to take a deeper look at the issue, approaching it from a different angle, starting with the fundamentals. First of all, we can start by laying out what I call the first principles of the energy equation. In other words, the core fundamental rules, the physical limits that simply cannot be exceeded. Only then can we start building solutions that respect those fundamental constraints. The first of these core principles is that a country's economic growth depends directly on its ability to transform energy. If you look at the relationship between the size of any country's GDP and its energy consumption, you'll get a straight line that fits with 99% accuracy. Let's chart that remaining 1% up to measurement noise. Now, if you project global GDP over time in relation to energy consumption, you also get a straight line. But this time, the line fits with 98.5% accuracy, and here, it's not just random noise. We can actually see an upward drift, gradually turning that straight line into a curve. It may seem subtle, but in reality, that small deviation is where the entire story of humanity's scientific and technological progress lies. Yes, really, this 1.5 1.5% deviation is well known in economics. It's what we call productivity gains. In other words, with each passing year, we use 1.5% less energy on average to produce the same unit of wealth, thanks to increasingly efficient machines. You could call it the numerical expression of human ingenuity, our ability to keep doing more with less. But beyond that, there is also a strict relationship over time between growth and energy minus the 1.5% deviation. So, there is effectively a physical law behind it, which means that any country that reduces its energy consumption will inevitably become proportionally poorer. That's why you can say this with confidence. Any political energy agenda based on planned or forced degrowth that promises happiness through poverty will, at the very least and without fail, deliver poverty. As for happiness, I'll let you discuss that with your priest or your favorite philosopher. So let's be very clear. We need energy to generate economic growth, and the relationship between the two is relentless. That's the first fundamental principle to keep in mind. The second first principle is the inevitable rise in energy density. This principle expresses itself over time in two ways. The first is the increase in the amount of energy dissipated per unit of mass. And this is not just a constant in human societies, but a trend that has been present since the creation of the universe, all the way through the development of our civilizations. Take a good look at the chart. It's fascinating. At least for me, it was one of those real wow moments. In short, it shows that human societies dissipate more energy per unit of mass than individual humans, who in turn dissipate more than plants, which dissipates more than the sun, which dissipates more than galaxies, and so on, all the way back to the birth of the universe. This chart has amazed me for years, and honestly, I should probably get it printed on a hoodie. Quick side note for the geeks and the environmentalist. You can actually see an acceleration in the increase of energy dissipation per unit of mass on this chart. Environmentalists are often deeply unsettled by this runaway dynamic, because what we are looking at here is indeed exponential cycles in motion. And this phenomenon even has a name, the Red Queen effect. Basically, this effect reflects a kind of runaway acceleration that has now become noticeable within a single human lifetime, which, I'll admit, makes our time a pretty incredible era to live through in terms of sheer experience. But from this, they conclude that we must absolutely slow down the pace of economic growth, because everything is evolving so fast that the pressures humanity exerts on its environment are becoming so intense that we risk breaking the machine. Two observations on this. First, from my point of view, there's no much point in fighting against the physical laws that's been unfolding since the birth of the universe. That seems a bit presumptuous. I imagine that understanding the phenomenon and working with it is probably a more successful approach. Second, since this dynamic has been active for nearly 14 billion years and it hasn't broke the universe, then we probably still have some room to maneuver. End of the side note, which was really just a way to say that eco-anxiety and degrowth-style environmentalism are, in all likelihood, dead ends. Because we've got nearly 14 billion years of uninterrupted growth behind us. So, at the scale of our human societies, this second principle translates into the use of primary energy sources with ever greater density. Here's another very telling chart that brings us back to something concrete. For each fuel source humanity has discovered throughout history, here's how long you can power a 100-watt light bulb with just 1 pound of that fuel. With wood, it's half a day. Then 2 days with a pound of coal, 2.5 days with a pound of oil, and then a leap, 13,000 years with a single pound of uranium. And that's not even mentioning a pound of deuterium and tritium used in a nuclear fusion reactor, which is the next big step after fission. We can clearly see that energy density increases as we discover new primary energy sources. In other words, as our technology advances. So, why is this second principle useful in our thinking? Well, logically, after the wood-based society came the coal and oil-based society, which is the one we still live in today. Then came the crucial next step that we collectively missed after World War II, the transition to nuclear power. Put differently, if we hadn't failed to scale nuclear nuclear energy after 1945, we probably wouldn't be struggling today with solar and wind issues. And that's where the key realization lies. Solar and wind are the energy sources of ancient societies. Think medieval times, when the entire economy depended on sunlight and wind, which are extremely low in energy density. In that sense, we are actually living in a regressive era. We've taken a step backward in the historical evolution of energy density. Yes, the atomic bomb may have helped end World War II in a few months or years earlier, but it may have also cost us a century of technological development if the fear it inspired ended up scientifically paralyzing us when it comes to nuclear power. And I don't say that lightly. Once mastered, nuclear is the most energy-dense, cheapest and safest form of energy we have compared to all others. And if you're worried about waste, radioactivity and all that, and you consider the EPCC to be a serious organization, then go take a look at the work of UNSCARE. It's nuclear equivalent of the IPCC, and you'll see that nuclear is the safest energy source we currently have, with 100% certainty. In other words, and yes, this is for the environmentalist, you can't fight climate change using the IPCC's work and at the same time claim nuclear is dangerous while ignoring UNSCARE's findings, because both organizations use the same methodology, the same scientific rigor, and both are part of the same international framework. So you can't accept one and reject the others just because it doesn't suit your worldview. That said, when I refer to the IPCC, I'm talking about the technical reports. The summary for policymakers is a different matter, a far more political document that I'm not relying on here. Making objective observation is already complex enough. Turning them into politic instruction is a whole different world. Anyway, this second principle shows us that we now face a serious timing issue when it comes to mastering third or fourth generation nuclear technology, simply because we failed to industrialize the first generation thanks to pathological environmentalism. And that's how we ended up with the so-called renewable energy stepping in to fill the gap, bringing along their own set of problems, but which we'll have to deal with because our times are what they are and our infrastructure are what they are. I know I've been a bit long, but it's important to lay out the context and the arc of history so you don't get misled by half-truths. To summarize, today, the full cost of producing 1 megawatt-hour from a wind turbine or solar panel may be lower than that of gas plant, but it's still higher than 1 megawatt-hour from an EPR or next-gen nuclear reactor, provided the nuclear industry is mastered. Of course, when making the comparison, we have to include the cost of flexibility that nuclear and gas provide to accommodate intermittent renewables. Otherwise, it's just cheating. Now, in China, yes, they have mastered EPR technology, and they even have a thorium reactor, just to give you an idea. It's important to recognize that today, so we can understand how to move forward. So, on the core issue, if so many experts in the energy world are grumbling about intermittent renewables, it's because they know the real topic is the serious revival of the nuclear industry. Keep in mind, every year lost sets us further behind on the global stage. We all agree on that. But unfortunately, that's not the issue behind the Spanish blackout, because that's not Spain's problem right now. We need to keep things in perspective. In other words, even if right now, with a magic wand, the world realized that it had to start building second and third generation nuclear plants, we still couldn't get rid of renewables overnight. And the reason is simple. Reindustrializing nuclear will take at best 10 years if some nuclear SpaceX came out of nowhere with ultra-competitive modular reactor like SMRs on steroids. Otherwise, at the current pace, we're talking 20 to 30 years. So in the meantime, we'll have to make do with what we've got, namely gas and oil. Through even there, we're facing tight global reserves. So we also need to lean on wood, hydropower, and the limited nuclear capacity we already have today. And finally, to make the best of a tough situation, we can also use solar and wind, because they are fast to deploy. And here's the thing, we're not actually facing an energy shortage, because energy is everywhere globally. What we're facing is a capacity factor problem. That's right, if prices are high, it's not because of oil prices or the amount of sunshine, but because of a lack of energy consumption, which causes our gas and nuclear power plants to run below their optimal load. And we need to talk about this, because the real short-term issue is this. The most expensive energy is the energy we don't consume. Yes, you heard that right. Put another way, anyone in the US, individual or institution, who tells you to save energy right now is, in effect, pushing electricity prices up. And even worse, people like me, let's say fairly well off, who can afford solar water heaters and heat pumps for heating, are actually driving up the price per megawatt hour for people who rely on direct electric heating because they can't afford better alternatives. So, what kind of madness is this? Well, now we need to explain it, and that will also help us come back full circle to the Spanish blackout. First, we need to understand that the current energy challenge is not about achieving an energy transition, because we already have plenty of energy sources. Now, the real issue is that we're undergoing a power transition, a shift driven by the increasing electrification of our daily lives as electricity gradually replaces thermal uses. Put simply, before, you'd heat your home with fuel oil and your car ran on gasoline. Now, we're powering our home with electric heat pump, and our cars are becoming fully electric too. Now, here's the key point. In a petroleum-based economy, energy prices are driven by the cost of the fuel itself, because it's an industry with predominantly variable cost. But in a more electrified society, we shift toward fixed cost industries, where the price of electricity is far more influenced by capital expenditure, the cost of building solar or nuclear power plants, which are expensive to build but relatively cheap to operate once up and running. So, the more we use our fixed cost infrastructure to produce electricity, the cheaper each megawatt hour becomes. And this is where the trouble begins, with intermittent renewable and with Spain. When you have gas, nuclear or hydro, you're making large upfront investment, but you're dealing with dispatchable energy sources. That's especially true for gas. A bit less for hydro, because when there's no water, well, there's no water, and a bit less for nuclear too, because you don't ramp up or down a nuclear plant at will. But fundamentally, you can adjust the output of this type of plants more or less when needed. That's why we call them dispatchable. So, naturally, in consequence, you'll design your power grid based on peak consumption levels to make sure you can handle the worst-case scenarios. But remember, the larger you build your capacity, the more you create the condition for expensive electricity. From there, having missed the boat on nuclear technology and finding ourselves in a tight spot, we decide to add wind turbines and solar panels to our energy mix. The problem is that wind and solar bring volatility to the grid because we can't control the supply of sun and wind. So, since this volatility has to be absorbed somehow, we end up building even more gas-fired capacity to cover both peak in demand and drops in renewable production. And what happens? We start building gas plants that only run for 20 or 30 hours per year, just to compensate for solar and wind intermittency, on top of managing demand peaks. And that's a double whammy. One that makes megawatt-hour prices skyrocket. And that's the point where everyone starts complaining, and rightly so. But like it or not, this is our current reality, because the billions in investment have already been spent on those plants. So now we have to find solutions that work with what we've got. And if possible, even find ways to make the most of it if we want to turn things around. And to top it off, wind and solar are low inertia energy sources because they don't have those heavy rotating turbines, the so-called rotating machines, that help stabilize the grid in response to sudden drop or surges in power on the 30-second time scale. That said, in practice, this lack of inertia isn't a huge deal. So, it's not the end of the world either. And blaming the Spanish for supposedly handling things like amateurs, saying the grid collapsed because they couldn't manage inertia due to those damn solar panels, well, honestly, that's a bit of a stretch. These people aren't exactly newbies, and this issue is well known by everyone in the field. Besides, as of now, we have no idea what actually caused the blackout. It might have been a chain of bad operational decisions and bad luck, as it's often the case in major accidents. But the thing is, the energy world is frustrated that our society is foolishly foolishly and cowardly missed the nuclear train. So now every opportunity is used to bash these poor intermittent renewables, which at the end of the day are just tools. Medieval tools, sure, but tools nonetheless. So then the real question is, how do we get out of this mess? Well, from where I stand, there are two main options, plus my own. The first option is to consume as much energy as possible to make the most of the fixed cost of our power generation infrastructure. That's the whole idea behind reindustrialization in the US. The second option is the tech race, which China has already fully embraced. Modular nuclear reactors, thorium plants, and more. The logic is simple. The sooner we have large, flexible, non-fossil, high-density power sources, the sooner we can stop talking about intermittent renewables altogether. Just so you know, nuclear is a big topic in the US again, and in China too. And then there's the bonus option, my own. It's an approach I've shaped through my experience in the energy sector, and it's about making smart use of what we already have, while we wait for nuclear tech to save the day. My idea is the concept of power farms, which I developed based on the experience of Brad Jones in Texas, former interim CEO of ERCOT, following the Uri disaster. He laid the foundation for grid flexibility in Texas in a report you can read. And the main takeaway is this: grid flexibility needs to come from the demand side. However, Brad Jones only saw the Bitcoin mining industry as a viable path for this model, because the 2021 context was especially favorable for it. Personally, I've developed a much broader vision, which we'll be discussing today. This is the idea of power farms, which my partners and I are currently industrializing in the US together with our collaborators. And to understand the power farm solution, you already have the foundation in this video, because by now you've understood that the real issue is that we've made grid flexibility the responsibility on the energy producers, simply because it's easier. That's right, on the demand side, individual consumers don't want time constraints, so they're not flexible at all when it comes to their energy usage. And on the industrial side, yes, there are flexibility programs, which I know very well. I've made a lot of money in that business too. But placing flexibility demands on traditional industry come with major limitation, because it puts heavy constraints directly on their core production processes. So yes, it can work. But it's not a silver bullet, because it's complex to implement. In terms of scalability, it helps of course, but it won't be enough. That's why today we put the burden of flexibility on the production side. It's just easier. But of course, this comes at a cost. It drives up electricity prices for all the reasons we've just discussed. And yes, when it comes to this issue, the rise of intermittent renewables has done absolutely nothing to help. Quite the opposite, in fact. But there's an alternative. We know that putting flexibility on the demand side is the best possible solution, because in theory, it costs nothing. It simply involves stopping consumption during peak periods. There's no need to build additional infrastructure, and it even helps to lower energy prices for everyone. What remains is to find what I call an ideal consumer, where ideal means they are able to shut down and restart their consumption with no constraints other than the limited production downtime and no negative impact on the rest of their businesses. I call this consumer super flexible, like a fluid in a supercritical state, which retains the density of a liquid but has no friction because its viscosity is similar to that of a gas. I end the side note here, but really go check out some video on supercritical freeze on YouTube. It's genuinely fascinating. In short, from the point of view of the electrical grid, a super flexible power farm maintains its density, meaning its business model remains intact, while being unaffected by stop-and-go cycles. That means zero friction between its operations and the needs of the grid. Now that's the theory, but we still need to find an industry that is electro-intensive, meaning it consumes a lot of energy, and that also meets these super flexible characteristics. Logically, such an industry should involve very little mass, minimal heat generation, and as few moving parts as possible. Because in industrial settings, it's mass to move, heat to dissipate, and mechanical complexities that create flexibility constraints. So that rules out blast furnaces, automotive plants, and let's be honest, most traditional electro-intensive industries. Except for one sector that clearly stands apart. That sector is the one that transforms energy into information. In this case, you have energy input and, to keep it simple, computers that use that energy to produce information output, which is then sold over the internet. Now, a computer doesn't generate much heat, typically 120 Fahrenheit to 160 Fahrenheit. It doesn't need to be physically moved from start to finish, and it has very few moving parts, apart from a few small fans, which are also very light. So, we should look for our super flexible consumer in the IT sector. And we are in luck, because since around 2010, computing has been consuming more and more energy. As I often say, the internet was the first revolution, allowing information to move quickly and at scale. But there's been a second revolution since around 2009 called HPC, High Performance Computing, which is all about producing huge volumes of information. In one sentence, the internet is about moving information, while HPC is about producing large volumes of information. So what we call data centers are the closest thing to our ideal consumers. And that's perfect, because demand for HPC is growing exponentially in our modern societies. This is where I introduce the concept of power farms. Instead of thinking in terms of specialized use case like I do blockchain with ASICs, I do AI with GPUs, I do data storage with hard drives, or I run databases and SaaS with CPUs. The principle behind power farms is to start from the needs of the electrical grid, because the common denominator across the entire HPC industry is megawatts power. And I know the electrical grid have massive needs for flexibility. But that's not all. If we really want to put the power grid at the heart of the service, then the best approach is to decentralize these small-scale power farms so they can relieve pressure on the electricity distribution infrastructure. Because if I install 500 megawatt or even 1 gigawatt in a single location, I'll need to upgrade the grid to distribute that power. But if I spread out that same gigawatt across dozens of smaller consumption centers, each drawing only a few dozen megawatts, then I only need minor local upgrades on the network and I can support the grid much faster and more efficiently. That's why I chose the name Power Farm, to illustrate this idea of decentralized cluster of super flexible consumption nodes. And it's working very well. We already have 27 megawatt up and running. We monetize computing time using machines called ASICs, and in few months we'll launch decentralized computing using GPUs, that is graphic cards, primarily for AI workloads. And where we really aim to make an impact is this. We will be the first to offer truly distributed AI computing, because we've placed grid flexibility constraint at the very heart of our business model, while most AI compute providers are building super rigid data centers that can't tolerate even the slightest disruption to their electricity supply. And once we start deploying power farms, electricity prices will naturally fall, because that's exactly what's happening in Texas, where we operate today.